Welcome to BFR Radio, a podcast dedicated to all things blood flow restriction training. This podcast is proudly sponsored by the BFR.co, where if you want to buy your own BFR cuffs, access online BFR training programs, increase your own BFR knowledge with the accredited BFR.co course, or you want more information about this type of training, this is your one place to go. And I'm your host, Dr. Chris Gavilio. Welcome back to BFR Radio and to our next episode in the ongoing Aerobic BFR exercise series. We've come a long way from cycling-based BFR sessions to sprint intervals. In the last episode, we looked at applying BFR after sprint intervals, particularly in trained cyclists, and saw meaningful gains in VO₂max. This is actually one of my favorite podcasts I've done in quite some time, and I feel is that the findings from this is really applicable to a lot of sports. And if you've never used it before, as I say, it's money for jam. You're putting it on during your rest periods. Now we're taking the next step. We're off the bike and onto the court. Today's study explores repeated sprint training combined with BFR in team sport athletes, specifically basketball players. For me, this is a fantastic transition point in the series, especially as we think about how BFR can be practically implemented in the field and court-based team environments. The title of today's featured article is The Effects of Repeated Sprint Training with Blood Flow Restriction on Strength, Anaerobic, and Aerobic Performance in Basketball. This study focused on how combining BFR with repeated sprint training over 4 weeks could impact strength, anaerobic capacity, and aerobic fitness in well-trained university-level basketball players. And before we dive in, this isn't the first BFR sprint-based training study I've reviewed. The training study I'm referring to looked at the effects of performing 6 100-meter sprints at 60 to 70% of the athlete's maximum 100-meter sprinting speed twice a week for 6 weeks. This study involved practical BFR, where they used elastic knee wraps to create the pressure. This was perhaps a more practical, no pun intended, method of using BFR, as I would think they could maintain running technique a little easier. At the end of the training block, the 100-meter time significantly decreased more in the BFR group compared to the non-BFR group. And that improvement was on average 0.38 seconds. And in the non-BFR group, 0.16. From a pure performance aspect, I noted a few things in that podcast from the paper that's worth noting here that I'll just repeat. This is the only training that both groups did. Typically, a sprinter would lift 2 to 3 times a week, and there would be other track-based sessions where they would work on maximal sprint velocity and run at faster speeds and different distances. And overall, I'll actually say they weren't elite. They were male participants running around 12 seconds for the 100 meters. Females at the elite level are running around 11 seconds. Irrespective, I feel that there is some nice takeaways of potentially thinking about how to include tempo-based work with BFR for athletes to complement a more rounded training program. If you want to listen to that one, remember to check it out after this podcast. On that note, let's get into today's episode. If we look at the theme of the paper was around repeated sprint training, which is a conditioning method in many team sports, especially basketball. It targets the athlete's ability to perform short bursts of high-speed efforts with limited recovery, closely replicating the demands of game play, where sprint effort are often repeated every 20 to 30 seconds. Physiologically, repeated sprint training taxes both the anaerobic system for the short explosive efforts and the aerobic system, that's the recovery between sprints. This dual demand makes it an excellent framework for integrating BFR, which can enhance both systems when used intelligently. This study therefore aimed to look at the effects of repeated sprint training in combination with BFR on strength, anaerobic, and aerobic performance in basketball players. These athletes had on average 12 years of training experience and trained approximately 10 hours per week, and they played for the university basketball team. The training study lasted 4 weeks with 3 sessions per week. Each session consisted of 3 sets of 8 maximal sprints. Each sprint was a 30-meter shuttle where the athletes would run 15 meters out and 15 meters back to the start. The rest between each rep was 20 seconds and 4 minutes rest between sets. The athletes were split into 2 groups. The first was the BFR group using inflatable cuffs, and another control group who did the same training session but didn't wear the BFR cuffs. For the BFR group, cuffs were worn on the upper thighs. Pressure began at 100 millimeters of mercury for the first session and was increased by 10 millimeters of mercury per session until it reached a final maximal pressure of 160. The BFR cuffs remain inflated during the entire sprint set, including rest between sprints. This is a critical distinction. This isn't post-exercise BFR like in the previous exercise. Here we're talking about active sprinting and recovery under BFR restriction and progressing inflation pressure over subsequent sessions. To evaluate the training outcomes, the researchers measured 3 things. The first was maximal strength, 1 RM bench press and 1 RM half squat. The squat was performed with free weights and performed to a 90-degree knee angle. Anaerobic capacity was measured via what they call a suicide run test, and this test is commonly used in basketball, and it consists of a total of approximately 143 meters of sprinting, including several change of direction tasks. This is performed on a basketball court where the athletes start at the baseline and run to 4 different lines according to the court as fast as they can. And then the aerobic capacity was measured via a 20-meter shuttle run test. This is a common and simple test of aerobic capacity. Athletes run between 2 lines of 20 meters apart. They begin at a speed of 8.5 kilometers per hour and increase every minute by half a kilometer per hour. Once they can't complete the shuttle, the final velocity is then used in a formula to calculate an estimated VO₂max. Now that we've set the scene with the training study, it's on to the results. And let's break down the improvements from pre to post training, comparing the BFR group and the control non-BFR cuff group. Firstly, looking at strength. Now, in the methodology, it didn't state what these athletes did during the study period with respect to strength training. Irrespective, for the half squat 1 RM, the BFR group increased their lower body strength by 22.7 kilograms, while the control non-BFR group improved only 14.4 kilograms. Statistically, the difference between the 2 groups was significant, and the effect size was 1.09, which is considered large, meaning that the improvement in strength was also practically meaningful. Also, when you dig into the paper a little bit more, at an average body weight of 81 kilograms, if we look at relative strength, the BFR group improved from 1.57 to 1.8 times their body weight. I don't have any data on strength levels for basketball players, but approaching 2 times body weight for these very tall athletes is something that, as a strength and conditioning coach, I'd be pretty happy with. For upper body strength and the bench press 1 RM, the BFR group improved by 10.8 kilograms and the control group 7.3. While the difference between the groups wasn't statistically significant, the effect size was moderate, suggesting that in practice, this kind of change could still be valuable depending on the context. To be honest, I'm not really sure why they measured bench press 1 RM, considering the context of the study, but it's interesting nonetheless. Looking at anaerobic capacity and the result for the suicide run time, which measured repeat sprint and change of direction under fatigue, the BFR group improved by 0.3 seconds, while the control group improved not as much, but they did improve a little bit at only 0.2 seconds. And while these are only small improvements, the BFR group showed a modest effect size, meaning that there's a small practical benefit, even though the difference between the 2 groups wasn't statistically significant. For aerobic capacity, VO₂max was calculated using the athlete's final running velocity. And VO₂max reflects how well your body can transport and utilize oxygen during exercise. The BFR group improved from 38.3 to 46.2 milliliters per kilogram per minute, an increase of an absolute value of 7.9. The control group also improved a little bit less, and they only gained 5.7 milliliters per kilogram per minute. The difference between both these groups was statistically significant, with a moderate to large effect size, indicating a meaningful advantage in aerobic development for the BFR group. The next question is, are these values any good? I did a bit of digging and looked at some different studies which showed a huge range of values, anywhere between 40 up to 75 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And the values also vary between playing positions. Some standouts from studies that looked at American university players varied between 53 and 65. And other searches indicated that the value for the BFR group, that was 46.2, may just sit under what would be considered to be good. Irrespective, this shows us some value for this intervention, but more so, these players may need to do some more of this kind of training. So in summary, we saw a larger improvement in lower body strength BFR, small gains in anaerobic performance, and greater improvements in aerobic capacity using the BFR intervention. These results are especially compelling for team sports where aerobic recovery and repeated sprint ability are important. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the article didn't specify whether the athletes continued their regular basketball training, such as skill work or gym sessions during the intervention. One would reasonably assume that they did, especially given that their university team status and they did 10 plus hours per week of training. If so, the improvements seen in the study are even more impressive as they occurred on top of their normal training load. So what does this mean for coaches and athletes? This study offers a really good case for using BFR in court-based sports. The protocol used here is easy to adapt. You apply the BFR cuffs to the upper thighs as per normal and use a progressive inflation strategy starting at 100 millimeters of mercury and increasing to 160 millimeters of mercury over time. In this case, you could use a 15-meter shuttle sprint with 8 reps per set, 3 sets total, a rest of 20 seconds between reps, and 4 minutes between sets. And try to attempt this 3 times a week for 4 weeks. One thing to note is around the pressures here and the cuff brand that they used. They used the Katsu brand, which is quite a thin cuff at around 5 centimeters. And typically in a lot of their lower body training studies, they would use pressures around 200 millimeters of mercury and more. Therefore, when you look at this pressure that they used in the study using the thin cuff, they've actually started at a lower pressure. They've built it up over time, but probably not to the same total pressure that they would normally do if you were doing a resistance training program. And one thing that I've found over time is when doing continuous cardiovascular work is that I would use a lower pressure. The cuffs from the BFR.co, they're 10 centimeters wide, and we use typically a lower pressure than, say, a Katsu brand. And using myself as an example, if I'm doing strength training, I would use 180 millimeters of mercury with the BFR.co brand. But when I'm doing something that's cardiovascular based, more so a stationary bike, I would drop it to 140 millimeters of mercury. Something to note there, that if you calculate your strength training pressure, you're actually starting a little bit lower, and over each session, you're acclimatizing the body or getting it used to the total pressure and building that up over the time. The other thing, this is a short 4-week study, and I always found in my own experience is that potentially you may only be able to use it in short bursts like this. But I do think to get true meaningful gains is you want to be doing it over a longer period of time. Irrespective, you could look at periodizing it in and out of the athlete's program, depending on where they're at within the season. The other thing that's really encouraging from this study is that the BFR group improved both strength and aerobic fitness, outcomes that would normally require separate types of training. This is consistent with the other studies that we've reviewed so far in the short series in aerobic BFR and provides an innovative method to amplify adaptations in a condensed training window. Also worth noting that there were no injuries or complications. This reinforces that BFR, when used intelligently and progressively, can be a safe adjunct to sport-specific training. To wrap this up, this is another really great study which bridges the gap between lab-based protocols into real-world team sport environments. If you're working with athletes who need to sprint, jump, and recover, all while training efficiently, then repeated sprint training with BFR might just offer an edge. And that's all for this episode. If you have any questions related to this, you can get in touch with me through my website, which is thebfr.co, or socials, which is at thebfr.co. You can also purchase your own BFR cuffs from our website, and you can find it at www.thebfr.co. And lastly, before I go, a couple of favors from me to you. If you know of someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes. As always, thanks for listening, and remember to keep the pump.